Los Angeles, November 1981. The Westlake Recording Studios stood in perfect stillness, the kind of profound quiet that exists only in the liminal hours between midnight and dawn. The daytime bustle of producers, engineers, and studio musicians had long since faded, leaving behind empty corridors and darkened control rooms. Only a single studio remained illuminated, a small island of light in the sleeping building. Inside Studio C, Michael Jackson sat alone at the Yamaha electric piano, his slender frame hunched slightly forward in concentration, fingers hovering above the keys as if waiting for permission from some higher creative authority. At 23 years old, he stood at the precipice of a transformation that would forever alter not just his own career, but the very landscape of popular music itself. Though Off the Wall had firmly established his adult solo career, something restless and unformed stirred within him. A vision of music that transcended existing categories, that integrated elements across the artificial boundaries of genre, race, and commercial expectation. The red light of the recording equipment glowed steadily in the dimness, the only witness to this solitary vigil. Michael had dismissed the engineers hours earlier, learning just enough about the equipment to operate it himself. A decision that reflected both his growing insistence on creative control and his increasing discomfort with being observed during his most vulnerable moments of artistic exploration. The studio logs would later show that he had signed in at 10 p.m. the previous evening, but inspiration had proven elusive, slipping away whenever he tried to force it into conventional form. Now, as the digital clock on the soundboard silently clicked over to 3:07 a.m., he remained suspended in that strange creative space between determined effort and surrender to something beyond conscious control. What had begun as a structured session working on material for his forthcoming album had gradually transformed into something more nebulous, more exploratory. Sheet music and lyric notebooks lay abandoned on nearby surfaces, his methodical approach giving way to a more intuitive process as the night deepened. For nearly an hour, he had been playing fragments, a bass line here, a melodic phrase there, percussion patterns tapped out on the piano's wooden surface, without committing anything to tape. These were not random experiments, but explorations circling some central idea he could feel, but not yet fully grasp, like a sculptor sensing the form hidden within a block of marble before the chisel touches stone. The solitude suited this process. Away from the expectations of producers, the commercial pressures of the label, even the supportive but inevitably influencing perspectives of musical collaborators, Michael could follow the thread of his instinct without explanation or justification. This private creative space had become increasingly precious as his fame grew, as his every professional decision became subject to analysis, evaluation, and inevitably commodification. Here, in these early morning hours, he answered to no one but the music itself, that demanding, elusive, essential conversation between what existed and what could be. Perhaps it was the particular quality of 3 a.m. consciousness, that strange clarity that sometimes emerges on the far side of exhaustion. Perhaps it was simply the culmination of ideas that had been germinating for months in notebooks, in hummed fragments recorded on cassette tapes, in observations about music's evolution and possibilities. Whatever the catalyst, Michael suddenly straightened, his hands finding their position on the keyboard with newfound certainty. Without hesitation, he reached over to the recording equipment and pressed the red button, the mechanical eyes of the tape machine now officially documenting what was about to emerge. What flowed from that moment was not a fully formed song in the conventional sense, not something that would ever be released as a single or even appear in this exact version on any album. Rather, it was a 17-minute continuous exploration, part composition, part improvisation, part sonic collage, that contained within it the DNA of what would later evolve into several of his most revolutionary works. The boundaries between melody and rhythm blurred and reconstructed themselves in new configurations. Vocal percussive elements that would later become his signature emerged organically as he sought sounds beyond what the piano alone could provide. Lyrical fragments wove in and out, sometimes fully voiced, sometimes reduced to breath and syllable, creating a narrative more emotional than literal. If this story moves you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories from music history. Moments when artistic evolution hung in the balance, when private creativity laid the groundwork for public revolution. These glimpses behind the carefully constructed final products remind us that even the most polished masterpieces begin as vulnerable explorations, as artists reaching towards something they can sense, but not yet fully articulate. As the improvisation continued, Michael moved between instruments. From piano to the drum machine, he had insisted be installed in the studio despite some engineers' resistance, to the simple 4-track recorder that allowed him to layer his own voice into harmonies and counterpoints that a single vocal performance could never achieve. This multimedia approach, this integration of technology as creative partner rather than mere documentation tool, contained the seeds of what would later revolutionize not just his sound but his entire artistic approach. Though he had no formal technical training, his intuitive understanding of how these elements could speak to each other, could create something greater than their individual contributions, revealed the producer's mind developing within the performer's established identity. Most striking to anyone who might have witnessed this solitary session, though no one did, would have been the contrast between Michael's well-known perfectionism in formal recording sessions and the liberated exploration of this private creative space. Here, without the pressure of creating a final product, he allowed himself tangents and mistakes, followed impulses that sometimes led to dead ends, embraced the productive messiness that underlies even the most seemingly immaculate artistic visions. Notes that cracked, rhythms that faltered momentarily before finding their groove, lyrical phrases that emerged half-formed, all became part of the organic whole rather than flaws to be corrected. This was creation as process rather than immediate product, a distinction that would become increasingly important as his career evolved. When the 17 minutes concluded, when the creative flow that had possessed him gradually subsided, Michael sat in silence for several moments, as if returning to ordinary consciousness from some deeper state. He made no immediate move to review what had been recorded. Instead, he methodically shut down the equipment, gathered his few personal items, and left the studio as quietly as he had occupied it for the past hours. The tape remained, the only evidence of a creative breakthrough whose significance would only become fully apparent in retrospect. The night cleaning staff, arriving shortly after Michael's departure, would have found nothing unusual. Just another recording session concluded, the studio returned to its neutral state awaiting the next artists. The tape itself, unlabeled except for the date and Michael's initials, was filed with dozens of other works in progress in the library of material being developed for his next album. Its significance might have been lost entirely among the more polished, more obviously commercial recordings emerging from the daytime sessions with Quincy Jones and the established studio musicians. What saved this particular recording from obscurity, what allowed it to become the influential document it later proved to be, was Michael's own meticulous involvement in every aspect of his creative process. 2 days later, reviewing potential material with Quincy Jones, he specifically requested this tape, much to the surprise of the engineering staff who had assumed it contained merely late-night experiments rather than serious content for consideration. As the recording played through the studio's high-end speakers, the reaction in the room evolved from polite interest to focused attention to genuine excitement. Quincy, whose production genius lay partially in his ability to recognize the commercial potential in even the most experimental musical elements, immediately began taking notes, identifying specific sections that could be developed, refined, and incorporated into more traditionally structured compositions. "This isn't one song," he told Michael after the tape concluded. "This is the blueprint for the entire album." It was not hyperbole, but professional recognition of how this seemingly informal exploration had unconsciously integrated the various musical directions Michael had been discussing, the harder-edged rock elements, the electronic and dance influences, the complex vocal arrangements that use the human voice as both melodic instrument and rhythmic foundation. More importantly, it captured an emotional authenticity, a creative voice that transcended the polished perfection of his previous work without sacrificing the accessibility that allowed his music to reach millions. In the months that followed, elements from this single improvised session would be extracted, refined, developed, and incorporated into what would eventually become several of the most iconic tracks on Thriller, an album that would not merely top sales charts, but fundamentally alter the landscape of popular music, breaking barriers of race and genre that had previously seemed impermeable. The bass line that would anchor one hit emerged directly from minute 4 of the recording. The vocal percussive elements that would become a signature sound could be traced to experiments in the 9th minute. A melodic phrase that seemed almost throwaway in the original exploration became, with development, the hook that would make another track instantly recognizable worldwide. Beyond these specific musical elements, however, the true significance of that 3 a.m. session lay in what it revealed about Michael's evolving creative process and artistic identity. The willingness to follow intuition beyond the boundaries of existing forms. The integration of technology not as gimmick, but as genuine creative partner. The understanding that rhythm and sonic texture were as central to emotional storytelling as melody and lyric. These approaches, nascent in that solitary exploration, would later define not just his most commercially successful period, but his most artistically revolutionary contributions to popular music. What no one present during the daytime playback session could have fully appreciated, perhaps not even Michael himself at that point, was how this private creative moment represented a larger pivot in his artistic evolution. The balance of power between performer and creator was shifting. The child prodigy who had been primarily an interpreter of others' material, the young adult who had collaborated as something closer to equal with established producers and writers, was becoming the visionary who would ultimately demand complete creative control over his art. That 17-minute recording, created in solitude without external guidance or commercial consideration, represented more than interesting musical ideas. It demonstrated his capacity to trust his own creative instincts, to follow them into uncharted territory without the validation of immediate audience response or industry approval. This shift would eventually transform not just Michael's own career, but the very concept of the pop star. From singer or entertainer to complete artistic auteur responsible for every element of their creative expression. The music video revolutions that would follow with Thriller, Beat It, and later Bad, and Smooth Criminal. The increasingly complex integration of dance, visual aesthetic, and sonic innovation. The business decision to purchase his own masters and control his catalog. All had their early roots in this move toward artistic self-determination. This growing confidence in his own creative vision independent of external validation or direction. Years later, after Thriller had become not just an album, but a cultural phenomenon, after Michael Jackson had transformed from successful solo artist to global icon, Quincy Jones would occasionally reference the 3 a.m. tape in interviews about their collaboration. There are moments in the studio when you know you're hearing the future, he once told music journalists. Not just a hit record, but the future of where music is heading. That tape was one of those moments. Michael alone with his creativity, following it wherever it led without worrying about rules or expectations. Everything we did after came from the seeds planted in those 17 minutes. The tape itself has never been released in its original form, despite the hunger for previously unheard material that followed Michael's untimely death in 2009. It remains in the vault of his recorded legacy, occasionally referenced in scholarly analyses of his artistic development, but unavailable for direct public experience. This absence has only enhanced its legendary status among musicologists and devoted fans, who debate its contents and significance based on the fragmentary descriptions that have emerged from those few who actually heard it. Perhaps this is appropriate, that a recording created in such private, vulnerable exploration should remain private, that its influence should be felt through the revolutionary works it ultimately spawned rather than through direct exposure. The 17 minutes captured that November night serve as a reminder that artistic revolutions often begin not with grand public statements, but with solitary figures following their creative instincts into unknown territory, trusting the journey even when the destination remains unclear. For Michael Jackson, alone in a darkened studio at 3 a.m., that journey led not just to the most successful album of all time, but to a transformation of what popular music could encompass, of who could create it and how they might approach that creation. The true legacy of that recording session lies not in the tape itself, but in what it represents. The moment when Michael Jackson fully claimed his creative voice, when the performer became creator, when the interpreter of others' visions began to manifest his own. In those 17 minutes of solitary exploration, the foundation was laid not just for Thriller, but for the artistic journey that would establish him as one of music's most significant innovators, an artist whose influence would continue to resonate through generations of musicians across genres and traditions. What began as one man alone with his creativity at 3 a.m. became, through its ripple effects across the musical landscape, nothing less than a revolution in sound, performance, and artistic possibility. If this video has touched you, if it has provided insight into how private creative moments can lead to public artistic revolutions, please like and subscribe. Share it with someone who might appreciate this glimpse into the vulnerable, solitary exploration that underlies even the most polished, commercially successful art. And remember that behind every groundbreaking album, every culture-shifting innovation, lies a human being following their creative instincts into unknown territory, someone willing to sit alone at 3 a.m., listening for something that doesn't yet exist, but somehow feels necessary, inevitable, essential to what music might become. In a climate-controlled vault containing Michael Jackson's musical legacy, among the thousands of tapes, hard drives, and notebooks documenting one of popular music's most extraordinary careers, sits a single unlabeled reel. Unlike the carefully preserved master recordings of his greatest hits, this tape bears only a date and his initials, written in his own hand during those early morning hours in November 1981. Its contents, those 17 minutes of solitary creative exploration, remain largely unknown to the public, its direct sound unheard by all but a handful of people involved in the creation of Thriller. Yet its influence resonates through decades of popular music, through countless artists who build upon the foundations Michael laid, through the very concept of what a pop musician could be and do. The tape itself may remain in darkness, but the light of what it ignited continues to illuminate music's evolving landscape, a fitting legacy for a moment of private creativity that ultimately changed everything.